in Dr. Musa's comments, he's provided us with a perfect segue to our next presenter, Dr. Andrew Miller, who comes to us from my home state, West Virginia, fellow mountaineer who is in the Department of Emergency Medicine at West Virginia University. He did his medical education at Southern Illinois University, then went on to do additional training in both emergency medicine and internal medicine, then completed a fellowship in pulmonary critical care medicine that was a joint appointment between the University of Pittsburgh as well as the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Miller is a very accomplished researcher and is the Vice Chair of Research at West Virginia University, and has also written extensively about what Dr. Musa pointed out continues to be a debate both amongst the faith community and the medical community, and that is, what is the determinant of death? Is it something that is brain death? Is it cardiopulmonary cessation of cardiopulmonary function? And Dr. Miller is going to shed some light on that topic. It's a matter of life and death, brain death from an Abrahamic faith perspective. So please welcome Dr. Miller to the podium.
Hello, my name's Andrew Miller. Bear with me with the voice and everything. I've been dealing with a respiratory issue for a couple weeks. But I have the honor to talk with you guys today about the issues of brain death as related to predominantly Islam, Judaism, and Catholicism will be the three main religions that I compare. I practice primarily emergency medicine and critical care, and this topic came out of my time working at the NIH, where I had a family that I had kind of become close with, a young Palestinian boy, and the family repeatedly asked me if it was Islamically okay to basically withdraw care, and we had also had to discuss issues of brain death. And so what I found was that an answer was not readily available, even if you asked imams. People didn't know. And so I took the last couple years to try to find the answer to the best of my ability. And so what I'll present is what I've found so far. But, you know, this can be an evolving field. And so while we wait for the slides, initially what I'm going to do is give a brief background of sort of the evolution of the definition of death in the Western culture, given that's where we live currently. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about jurisprudence and the available evidence and how it applies to the jurisprudence in Islam, Judaism, and Catholicism, and then we'll summarize.
Apologies for the, it was working before. Famous last word. There we go. It needed the Nintendo unplug and blow it. Dr. Miller, would you be able to hold the microphone up to you?
Yeah, sure. Sorry if you guys can't hear me very well. And so, when talking about what defines death, the first issue is it depends on who you are and where you're at. Traditionally, it's been seen as the cessation of cardiac function, the absence of a pulse, and that's a definition that's pretty widely used in the pre-hospital setting, in acute care settings, and in other medical settings. But it gets confusing when one gets to the ICU or to the operating room, where sometimes there's this synergy of man and machine, and there's interference or technology obscures your ability to tell certain things. So, example would be being on a ventilator and someone's sedated, you're not sure if they can breathe or not. Things like ECMO and cardiac bypass can supplement cardiac function and preserve brain function, even if the heart isn't working. And if you think about people who are getting transplanted, people get heart and lung transplants at the same time. There's a period of time where they don't even have a heart or a lung, but their brain function is still preserved while they're on bypass. And so it raises this question of how long does there need to be an absence of function before it is termed irreversible and death is declared. And traditional definition of checking a pulse and stuff like that just doesn't work in these situations. And like I mentioned, this technology has created a sort of interference in our decision-making process, especially in the unit. And interference creates uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, you start reaching out to try to find a better way or a different way to answer a question. And that sort of happened around the 1950s, where two major advances brought up this issue of brain death. The first being advance of development of the ventilator and ability to ventilate people. And the second being the release of cyclosporin, which was a transplant drug that dramatically improved outcomes from organ transplantation. Thus, there became an increased need for organ availability. And people started discussing these issues of brain death, at least in the Western world at that time. In 1959, Malarat and Gouillon published a series of cases where they described these patients with irreversible coma. And that was sort of the start of the discussion of this issue of brain death. And in the 1960s, different commissions had met, but Harvard had put together a commission, and they kind of put forth the definition of brain death at that time, which for their purposes was totally unaware to external stimuli, no brainstem reflexes, no evidence of spontaneous breathing, and a flat EEG, which subsequently has sort of fallen off the criteria, but it initially was part. So in 1969, at the First World Meeting on Transplantation, there was an interfaith consensus between Muslim scholars, Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic scholars, where they kind of came to a consensus, and their agreement was that cerebral death was a reasonable concept and fully within the province of the physician to identify. So early on, there seemed to be an interfaith agreement that brain death was death. In the U.S., death is determined by state law, and each state makes their own laws. So there's a lot of heterogeneity with regards to what the definition of death was at the time. So the National Conference of Commissioners for Uniform State Laws came up with this thing called the Uniform Declaration of Death Act, or Determination of Death Act, where they defined it as either irreversible cardiorespiratory cessation or irreversible cessation of all the functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. And this was adopted by all 50 states, but subsequently some states revised it. But it was meant to try to unify the way that death was being described in the U.S. But internationally, there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity with regards to how people define death. And in a survey of 80 countries, 60% didn't even have a national standard. And a little bit over half didn't even require apnea testing. You didn't even have to see if the person could breathe or not. 40% required ancillary testing that's not helpful, like the EEG or cerebral angiogram, those sorts of things. But it's not just internationally, it's the U.S. Survey of U.S. hospitals, 12% failed to identify exclusionary criteria if the person had been given a paralytic or been placed on sedation and before you're trying to do an apnea test. And 4% don't even require apnea testing, which is a problem. And these types of things we'll get to when we get to the Jewish section, but led to state exemptions in New York and New Jersey, where essentially there's a patient can religiously exempt them, or their family, their surrogate can reject the application of brain death criteria, and the physician has to find a different way to diagnose death. And those came out of mostly outlash from the Jewish population, but I'll get to that point. Apnea is the absence of breathing. Yes, not breathing. So physicians with all this different sort of medical information and all these different legal avenues coming towards them have to then mesh that with culture, both their own and other people's, and religion that may or may not be their own. And so it creates a very difficult task for us, probably underestimated by a lot of people how difficult it can be. I'm going to try to create a level playing field for everybody, for each of these religions. And so if some of this you know, just don't worry about it. Hopefully we'll get to something you don't know. But in Islam, I'm going to sort of divide it between Sunni and Shia, the two largest sects of Islam. But there's four primary forms of religious law or rulings, and then there's a fifth that we'll also discuss. There's nusus, which is the textual sources, which are the Quran, which is the primary holy book of Islam, and Sunnah, which are the traditions of the Prophet. And this varies significantly between the Sunni and the Shia, but they both call them Sunnah. And so I'm just going to sort of leave it at that. You can ask about it later if you have a question about that. But the greatest bulk of material for the generation of laws during the formative period was the Sunnah. If the answers aren't there, we go to what's called ijma, which is sort of a unanimous consensus of scholars. And this is sort of uncommon in the Sunni world in modern times. It was very common in the early centuries after the Prophet, and then around the 10th century, some would say the gates of ijma closed because they had worked out most of the problems that they were dealing with. But ijma still happens today, but it's uncommon because the ummah, the community is so large, it's almost impossible to get a unanimous consensus among scholars. And for Shia, it was always sort of an ambiguous importance and isn't really used so much with Shia. And then there's precedent-based analogy, or qiyas, forgive my pronunciation, which isn't used by Shia at all, is really only used by Sunni. And you compare and contrast the Quran and the Hadith with each other with the current situation and try to come up with like an injunction and develop a rule. And that leads us to ijtihad, which is controversial among Sunni scholars, but is widely used, is one of the most widely used forms of law in Shia Islam. And ijtihad is exercised by, there are criteria on who can exercise this, and those types of scholars are called muftis. But important things to say is that the ruling is an opinion, because it's considered probable, because it's based on human intellect and there's inherently some possibility for error. And so it's non-binding and it's non-obligatory. Contrary to what people hear in the media about fatwas and stuff, it's an opinion. It's a well-informed opinion that is to be given, credit. I'm not trying to discount it, but it's not binding, and that's why we'll find that fatwas often disagree with each other on this topic, because individuals disagree with each other. And this only applies to gray areas of the law where issues where the Hadith and the Sunnah and Ijma have not addressed it. So if we apply this to brain death, to the textual sources, certainly there's no precise definition of death in the Quran, and there's been international Islamic legal conferences about this, and the conclusions have always been that the Quran does not define death. And there's no precise definition of how to recognize that the soul's departed from the body. So if we're going in order of evidence, then we would go to ijma, but since I just mentioned that scholars disagree, there's not going to be a consensus. Qiyas don't apply in this case, and so then we're left with ijtihad. And I mentioned ijtihad, that there's sort of a difference in the way Sunni and Shia view it, and that may help inform why the different groups have come to different decisions with regards to issues of brain death. And so I'll start this off with the Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences in 1985 basically talked about this and did not acknowledge brain death as death. They acknowledged it as unstable life, a dying but not dead. If there's any Jewish people in here, it would be like safek gosis. It's an unstable life. The following year, and this will become important, IOMS is from Kuwait, and I'll tell you why that's relevant in a couple of slides. At the Third International Conference of Islamic Jurists, which occurred in Amman, Jordan, this was a meeting of the Islamic Fiqh Academy of the Organization of Islamic Conferences, which is centered in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. They ruled that a person is considered legally dead, and all the principles of Sharia can be applied and established if there's either irreversible stoppage of the heart and lung, and it's been confirmed by a doctor, or there's complete stoppage of all vital functions of the brain, and doctors decide that it's irreversible, and the brain started to degenerate. And if that's the case, then you can disconnect the life support systems, even if some organs are artificially functioning, using the heart as an example. The following year, first, this left some unanswered questions though. First of all, it said vital functions of the brain. What does that mean? It wasn't defined. And which brain death criteria are being used? Whole brain, brain stem, cellular? It just says, brain death criteria. What kind of doctor and what level of training is required to be able to determine if a person is brain dead? What level of certainty must that person have? And is this degeneration issue really necessary as part of the definition? How do you determine this? Are you supposed to brain biopsy all these patients to determine if there's brain degeneration? What kind of advanced testing is required? And so there were still unanswered questions, which brings us to the following year. The Islamic Fiqh Academy of the Muslim World League, which is centered in Mecca, sort of tried to clarify things, and they made a few distinctions from the prior ruling, indicating that it needs to be 3 doctors that agree that brain death has occurred and it's irreversible. And then they say that any legal consequences linked to the determination of death come into effect only after circulation and respiratory function have stopped. Which is odd, because what that means is that medical death is not legal death. And brain death is not the same as cardiac death. So it implies 2 separate parallel tracks of death, which of course left confusion within the community. So I talked about sort of the 3 sort of consensus statements, but it led to a number of scholars yielding fatwas from various countries, of which I listed a few, 2 from South Africa in back-to-back years, which opposed each other. One from the UK, which suggested it is true death, one from Indonesia. But my point is that although it would seem that more of the rulings are in favor of brain death being true death, not all. It's not a consensus. And if you parse this out, looking at the Sunni and the Shia ones, most of the Sunni ones say yes, and most of the Shia ones are more often no. So, for ruling for physicians who are practicing in Islamically predominant countries, they also have to deal with what their state laws are, and then their medical organizations. And so, I quickly searched the Middle East and the Near East and found 11 countries that have laws specifically addressing brain death. 9 of those 11 countries have legislation that says brain death is true death. 2 do not, those being Kuwait and Egypt. Kuwait is where the Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences is what I mentioned earlier. And Egypt is where my colleague talked about this great debate regarding organ transplantation and using live donors or not live donors. And so it's not surprising to me that those 2 were split off. If you look at professional organizations in the US, the Islamic Medical Association of North America basically just reiterated brain death criteria and then added some language to the level of training that's required to make the diagnosis of brain death. But they said they felt brain death was true death. So if you look at everything that all the available sort of Islamic type evidence that we could put together, basically you're left with ijtihad, which is unclear. Maybe leans towards yes, but is unclear. state laws, which are not truly religious, and professional organizations suggest. So it leaves it unclear. But I think Sunnis more often than not have moved towards accepting it, and some other groups have hesitated to do that. So for Judaism, there's three main sources of religious law. There's Torah, there's rabbinic law, and long-standing custom. And the word for law is Halacha. And Halacha from any of these sources are referred to as commandments or mitzvahs. And so there's 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, and they trump everything else. But when you get to rabbinic law, which is where most law comes from, people use the Talmud, which is divided between the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is sort of the redaction of the oral Torah, where it's sort of put together in a compendium. And the Gemara is then the rabbinic clarification and discussion of the Mishnah. And then the actual rabbinic mitzvahs, which Gezira are things that are like meant to prevent people, they're laws that were generated to prevent people from, laws that were generated to prevent people from breaking Torah law. Takana, which are unrelated to biblical laws but are for the public good, and minhag, which are those long-standing customs that arose from a religiously good place. And they have sort of become binding, although there wasn't a lot of evidence. And then there's the Shulchan Aruch, which was compiled in the 1950s, in the 1560s by Rabbi Cottle in Israel. And what that is a condensation of all that prior law into what's relevant for modern times. And it's one of the more commonly used sources of law in modern times. A lot of the old stuff was felt to be not relevant, and so it was left behind. So, in the Torah, it makes a lot of references to death. I'm only going to bring up two just to make the point that, so it doesn't clearly define death, but it links breath to life in kind of many places in the Bible. And so, what that was done is in the Talmud, people took these stories and sort of, let me step back. So people had a tendency to link death to a person's ability to breathe. In 1970, if you remember, the brain death stuff was sort of really ramping up in the 1960s. In 1970, Dr. Konigsberg and Rabbi Rabinowitz made reference to Oholat 1.6 in the Talmud, which stated, which kind of compared death to a decapitated animal. And they made the argument that brain death should be a valid type of criteria. And there was this enormous backlash in the Jewish community that completely squashed that, and also led to laws being changed in like New York and New Jersey. And mostly people describe Yoma 85, which is where a person gets buried alive and it's on the Sabbath, and the rabbi is asked, what do we do? And they're told to dig until you can see if he's alive. And they say, well, how far do we dig? And they said to his nose, just to see if he can breathe. And they said, well, what if he's upside down? And then they said to his chest, so you can see if his heart's working. But it didn't he didn't mention anything related to neurologic function. And so people clung fairly, or people use that to support arguments regarding cardiorespiratory arrest, but not brain death. And then in Cullen and Gittin are different examples, all kind of leaning towards cardiopulmonary arrest, but also not using neurologic criteria. And so the evidence from the Talmud would suggest that no, it's not. So you don't really need lower level evidence if the Talmud suggests that no. I would just say that a couple famous rabbis have also written extensive, or had also written regarding respiration and pulse and as a determination of death. And so in Judaism, brain death would not be accepted. So for Catholicism, briefly, the sources of law would be revelation, which would be the scripture, followed by sort of church instruction, which practically starts at the level of the local priest and works its way up to the council at the Vatican. And if they can't come to a decision on a ruling, then they refer it to the Pope, and then his ruling is considered binding. So I sort of mentioned the Bible doesn't, or the Old Testament or the Torah doesn't discuss brain death, and certainly the New Testament doesn't either. But this got referred up to the Pope twice. First to Pope John Paul II, and they felt that his ruling wasn't completely clear, and so it ended up going to Pope Benedict subsequently. But basically what he says is medicine can't determine the exact moment of a person's death, but they can determine if death has occurred. And that by whichever means you use, whether it's cardiac, pulmonary, or brain, you can determine that the person is dead. And so this was taken as a support of the use of brain death criteria amongst Catholics. But some people were still sort of unclear, so it went to Pope Benedict, who put out this very articulate discussion on the topic, stating there's no right kind of death. When meeting a final common endpoint, death, the order in which heart, lung, and brain cease to function do not define different deaths. There are, however, different forms of death, and most people are more comfortable, obviously, used to the traditional cardiorespiratory arrest form of death. The traditionally accepted sequence has been that after the heart-lung arrest, loss of consciousness first, and then brain death occurs. In the early 1950s, the advent of mechanical ventilators allowed for artificial prolongation of cardiac and lung function and reversed the conventionally accepted chain of events to one initiated with death of the brain, followed by the heart and lung. Society has not had sufficient time to accept and change to a paradigm in which death does not follow the pattern of heartbeat arrest. Thus, brain death can only be blamed as being relatively young, artificial construct based on a counterintuitive concept. This does not imply that brain death is not a biological truth. And so this was taken to mean that brain death is true death amongst the Catholic Church. And so, just in summary, Judaism says no, Catholicism says yes, and Islam says maybe. Thank you.